going to try to quit looking down at my clock here and just try to go through. So we've talked about, again, in red blood cells, they pretty much have to do this. In muscle cells, muscle cells do have mitochondria, and they can conduct the citric acid cycle, but eventually those muscle cells will run out of oxygen when you're really using them. And so what happens when they do that is they'll build up lactic acid, or this lactic acid can be converted to lactate. But they'll use lactic acid then as the receptor of this electron in the NADH, so we can strip the hydrogen off, and then I've got NAD ions ready to go back in. So we'll convert your muscle cells. In order to keep glycolysis going, they need this NADH. So they'll ferment the pyruvate into lactate and lactic acid to do that. All right, so that's a little bit, that's just kind of a couple of examples of fermentation that is anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic is when we don't have oxygen, or we don't use oxygen to continue the process. Okay. All right, so so basically what I'm doing today is I'm finishing up a couple of sections at the end of chapter 7, just hitting on a couple of high points in those sections. And then we'll peer just briefly into chapter 8 today. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. One thing, there's a section there towards the end of chapter 7. They really want to emphasize everything we've talked about. You know, if we go all the way back here, you know, we just talked about putting glucose into this cycle, right? Just putting glucose into this cycle and then cranking it through the electron transport chain and ATP synthase to generate ATP. But again, there's a section here where we just want to make it very clear. And the text has talked about this. I've not mentioned it a lot, but it's not just glucose. We can put other saccharides in there. You can take fructose or lactose or any of the other monosaccharides. They can be converted. There's enzymes that can convert those into a compound that can be then accepted into glycolysis and or the electron transport chain. I'm sorry, the citric acid cycle. So they can still also be used. It's not like the body's just going to throw those away. It just has other enzymes that convert those into useful components so they can have the cycle. But then what about these other compounds? So triglycerides and these big fatty acids, there's 3 fatty acids on a triglyceride. There's lots of energy stored in here. How can we use that? Well, you look at pyruvate, which is what comes off of, we generate 2 pyruvates off of 1 glucose to go into the citric acid cycle. Is there any way we can turn these parts of the triglycerides into pyruvate so it's ready to go in the citric acid cycle and be broken down? Sure, yes. There are enzymes that will do just that. And it comes down to, do the cells need this much energy? Because it's going to take some enzymes and some other processes to break these down and convert it into this so it's ready to go in. It can be done. It takes work and it takes the right processes. But there's lots of energy to be had in here if the cells need it, and then they have time to break this down and the tools to do it. You can also use amino acids, right? If we remove this amine group and that gets excreted, this generates ammonia, which gets turned into urea, which gets put into urine, and that's how we excrete the remnants of the amino acid. We've got to remove this amino group off of amino acids in order to utilize the rest of this and convert this into pyruvate so it goes in the citric acid cycle. But it can also go both ways. And so this diagram is in your text. I added this label here, citric acid cycle, to make sure we remember that's what this is going on down here. But here's what we normally talk about. Glucose gets converted to pyruvate, and then add the coenzyme A, and that's ready to go in the citric acid cycle. But what they're saying here is, look, there's all these other amino acids, there's all these other compounds that can go in and out of that citric acid cycle at any point. So it's just, as I mentioned here, not only glucose. It doesn't just have to be glucose. All of these other compounds can go into the citric acid cycle, and the intermediates, it's also important to understand that the intermediate compounds, as we go through the citric acid cycle, can also be used to produce some amino acids. They can be converted to fatty acids to be stored later. There are other things we can do. It doesn't just have to go through the cycle. If the body needs these other compounds, it can strip them out and put them to work. Or if it doesn't need, if it has a surplus of a particular compound, then the body can figure out how to convert it and put it into the citric acid cycle. Okay, so again, it's not just a closed loop and it's not just for glucose, but that's to keep it simple when we first present it. That's how we do it. All right, I'm gonna stop there. We'll pick up the next video.